Hello everybody, hello. This is either going to be part 2 or I'm just going to go ahead and edit these first videos together. But in that case, if it is going to be the videos together, you're not going to hear this message. But if not, the video originally is a little bit shorter because I originally forgot to change the title before starting stream. And the title makes no sense for the topic we're dealing with right now. But the title is changed. Luckily, we only did about 10 minutes and it wasn't a couple hours before I realized, but let's just get right into it. So we're talking about Charles I here when we're believing his rights in the divine right to be king. So let's just continue on with what we were saying. Charles inherited his father's belief in the divine right of kings, a doctrine upheld by the entire Stark dynasty, one of the most powerful families ever to have ruled Scotland. They believed that kings were only chosen by God to rule and that only God could overrule them. Charles also believed that he had the sole right to make laws, so to oppose him was a sin against God. He generally believed that a dictatorship was the only effective form of government. The magnificent Rubens ceiling painting at the Beniquian House, completed in 1636, was commissioned by Charles to celebrate these divine principles. In this detail of the main canvas, the officiates of James I, his father, is portrayed ascending to heaven in a cloud of glory. So, in other words, he sees himself as almost a godlike figure, or at the very least, somebody that was chosen by God to represent the country and to be the king of the country. Therefore, he has some, for lack of better words, magical stance, magical brain, magical health, magical superiority over everybody else because he was chosen by God himself. And then at the very worst, you could say he believed that he was God. So those are two very interesting concepts, and also things that have that many people have shared before. He's not the only one to believe in that, especially when it comes to the royal family and many members that thought they were directly chosen by God and directly were to make rules, as I mentioned also, because rules are a very important part. And if you see yourself as chosen from God and you see yourself as the only form of effective government being a dictatorship, then you are obviously going to rule with a heavy hand or a heavy fist, whatever terminology you want to use. And that can make the citizens of the country that he is ruling over feel very bad, feel very insuperior, feel like they're not really getting represented. You can see that in a lot of examples, really, and throughout history. And most of the time when citizens start to feel like their values aren't being shared and that you are almost mocking them as being citizens of your country, that's when revolutions start to happen, or when bad things start to happen for the person that is imposing their power. And we would later see that with King Charles I as he was executed. So his way of ruling, his government, so to speak, was not the most effective way for going about his ruling, and ultimately led to his demise. We're going to scroll down a little bit more. Oh, we'll have to adjust our page once again. Oh, not that far. Not that far. Okay, a king defeated. The Royalists made a strong start, and their cavalry remained undefeated until 1644. Gradually, the parliamentarians, under genius Oliver Cromwell, began to gain the upper hand in what will become the bloodiest war ever fought on English soil. The Battle of Naseby in June 1945, and the defeat of the Royalist army probably marked the turning point in the war, although fighting dragged on until 1649. we're going to read the did you know part that is just slightly off screen here. Some families had bitterly divided loyalties, brother fighting brother, but religion cut deeper, with the Catholics tending to support the king. So now we're going to be talking about some imprisonment values here. And once again, we're going to have to move this just because I like the screen to be a little bit bigger. Although it makes that we're going to have to adjust on things, but that is a-okay. But let's continue on here. Imprisonment. In 1646, Charles was imprisoned by Cornwall and put under house arrest in the old Tudor royal apartment at Hampton Court Palace. From what he famously escaped, he was soon recaptured and kept prisoner at Crispinborg Castle on the Isle of Wight, which he was well treated. But despite many opportunities, Charles refused to repent and seek peace. He stubbornly refused to accept defeat or to submit to the Reduction authority, because he saw himself as the authority. So you can see a little bit of his stubbornness and his perspective of trying to get out. Well, I guess in better words, a better way of putting this is with him seeing himself as a god or chosen by God. The idea of him deciding to just all of a sudden not okay. Let's put it this way. If you see yourself as a godlike figure or someone who is chosen by God, the idea of accepting someone else's authority is probably not going to be something you're going to be willing to do or going to do at all. So that is very important to his psyche, and it makes sense why he would refuse to do so if he sees himself in that way. And we know that many historians and many people have said that Charles I did view himself in that way. So he's being consistent in his worldview, although his worldview really ultimately led to his demise. Sad farewells. Charles I was given just 3 days to put his affairs in order and say goodbye to his family. After the trial, he was taken by a seating chair in a short distance to an old room at the Whitehall Palace. Charles refused to see anyone but his children and his chaplain, Bishop Juxon. The next day, Keane was moved to St. James Palace. Charles spent the day burning papers, praying, and saying sad farewells to his youngest children, Henry, Duke of whatever, age 9, and Princess Elizabeth, who was 11. We go down. A father's last words. The king told his youngest not to grieve. They should obey their older brother Charles, the lawful sovereign. Elizabeth cried hysterically when she realized she would not see her father again, and he had his own tears to calm her, as we see here in the picture of the royal family's children from Charles I and the wife. Sweetheart, you will forget this. Charles consulting his daughter. Okay, let's move this again so we can see the text. Okay, prayers and preparation. The following morning, Tuesday the 30th of January, the queen rose early and dressed for the icy weather, asking for a thicker than normal shirt so that he wouldn't shiver, and people wouldn't think he was cracking with fear. He then retreated with Bishop Juxon to pray until a knock came on the door at 10 a.m. Charles the bishop and his attendant Thomas Herbert walked across the St. James Park, the queen wrapped in a black cloak, surrounded on all sides by guards. The king was taken to his bedchamber in the Whitehall Palace to await summons to be scaffolded. This came 3 hours later. Charles walked across the floor in the banqueting house beneath the Rubens calling painting which 20 years before he had commissioned from the Rubens. A bitter day. A huge crowd had gathered in the bitter weather, but they had so far away from the king's final short speech was short in freezing air. Erected against the banqueting house in Whitehall, the scaffold was hung round with black cloth. In the center of the blackened and sanded floor stood the axe and a lower quartering block of a kind used to dismember traitors. Two men, heavily distinguished with masks, stood ready to perform the act. The death of a king. The king, in his hair now bound in a white nightcap, took off his cloak and lay down. He told the executor that he would say a short prayer and then would give a signal when he was ready. After a little pause, the king stretched out his hand and the axe fell, the executor serving his head in one clean blow. I go from corruptible to an incorruptible blah blah blah. A horrifying death. Many watching were exhausted, with one witness commenting, "There was such a groan by the thousands then, peasants as I never before desire and may never again." Revenge of the King. Under Charles II, the surviving 41 Republicans who had signed the death warrant were called to account. Most fled abroad or surrendered voluntarily to avoid execution. The 10 who refused to beg for forgiveness were tried and sentenced to death. After Restoration, Royalists dug up Oliver Cromwell's rotting corpse and hanged it in Tyburn. So this was Charles II getting revenge. A beautiful legacy. Charles I remains the only English monarch to have been tried and executed for treason. In the years after his death, the muddle of Parliament sobered life under Puritans and ultimately failure to establish a functioning government. People started viewing Charles I differently. Perhaps Charles I's most important legacy in his fabulous art collection, which now forms the Royal Collection. The execution of Charles I, it was remembered every year on the 30th of January with a service in the banqueting house. His arts, blah blah blah. And then there's a movie about Charles I. So we're going to go ahead and bounce to the first video I have. Then we're going to read a little bit more summaries and just see if we can gain some more information. But we're going to bounce to one of our shorter videos and get some information on who Charles I is and why there is so much attention to his reign and how he was ultimately viewed and why he has a celebration, blah 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 blah. Once I resize this so that we can see it on full screen. Looks like this is good here, but we're going to start this up.
The trial of Charles I, I think, arguably is probably the most important event in British history. It's the first time when a legitimate head of state has been put on trial by a formal procedure for his life in the name of the people. So it was a moment when the sovereignty of the people overrode the divine authority of a king. One of the reasons why this is a significant moment is because it's the first time, certainly in British history, probably in European history, when there is a direct challenge between popular sovereignty and royal authority. So the idea that's born in it and is celebrated later on in 1688 and in the American Revolution of 1776 is that legitimate authority is created by the consent of the people.
So that's a very interesting idea, really. And I mentioned it at the start of the first video, where ultimately the idea here, as he basically stated, but I stated it in a slightly different way, was this was one of the first examples where you could see that the majority of people do have a sway over the royal government. Now, most of the time, these events tend to happen in civil war, and as I mentioned, there was a civil war, and there was a history of trying to get new kings while Charles I was on the kingship and whatnot. But ultimately, they took him to trial instead of doing like the French Revolution or something related to that. But like we mentioned, with Charles I, he believed in divine authority, and that would mean that he believed that he was chosen by God or is God. And both of those perspectives would ultimately mean that he was willing to rule with an iron fist and willing to be the victor, the person, the head of the entire nation, and everybody else was significantly lower than who he was and how he views himself. So that is kind of interesting, and you can see that even at an early level of government with Charles I in the 1600s, you started to see that people ultimately were not willing to be considered in that way, and that people's authority, the mass, do have a sway over the royal government, or do have a sway over the rulers. So if the rulers choose to ignore them, then it could potentially come back and not be a good result, because they do have a sway either through revolutions, through trials, or through any other means possible for them to be overturned or for something similar to happen. In other words, the mass people have a sway over the world government, even if the world government believes that it has a divine authority over everybody else.
And there is a trust between community and ruler, and the ruler has to obey the office of trust, which is to benefit the common good. And Charles I is put on trial for compromising that, for breaking his trust, for acting in an ungodly and bloody way, actually persecuting and killing his people. So it's the first time that's instantiated in an event, and the claim of Parliament to judge the king in the name of the people was received with horror around the other monarchs of Europe. So it is the first moment of democratic resistance, if you like. The very event of the trial is in itself a significant constitutional moment, but the fact that the king was killed stunned not only the British state, but the entire literate European world. This was, and it's a slightly horrible analogy, but
before he gets to his analogy there, that's not only do the masses have a sway, not only could they use resources like the revolution or different methods similar to that, but they have so much of a sway that they can put the king to death despite his belief that he has divine authority. And that is very interesting. Yeah, that is extremely interesting to me, because I'm not a huge person on British history or European history. I probably know more about European history than American history, really, because I was at an international school and we did a lot of European history because of it, and not so much Texas history, because I do live in Texas, or American history. And ironically, most of the classes where we did have a semester on American history, or a couple of weeks on American history, were taught by someone who's obviously American, but their first place of birth was not in America. Not that has too much to do with anything, because they've been citizens for many years, but I think that it's kind of interesting that it's potentially taught with someone who is European and also American, so maybe it provides some insight there when learning American history through the lenses of that. But ultimately, I know a lot more about foreign history, but I don't necessarily know too much about this time period. But if this is the first example, without war necessarily, or without revolutions necessarily, of the people putting a king to death through the usage of a trial, that is extremely interesting interesting to me, and it shows really the amount of power that people do have over the government, even if the government perceives itself as being the head authority and the power and the only power that you should be having to be concerned with. Once again, it still goes back to that divine authority that Charles I believed in. So the idea that he could die from the people's hands because he was a bad person, or whatever you want to use for the reason of why, is interesting. And you would think that wouldn't really necessarily happen, especially with how much power the royal family had in the 1600s and around that time period compared to, say, what the royal family has now for power. But let's continue on.
But it's like the Twin Towers with the planes flying in and destroying the sort of cultural stability. Killing the king was killing God. God had appointed kings, and the Old Testament is full of examples, to rule over a sinful people. So killing the king, even though he was a tyrant, and they very cunningly in the trial reclassified him not as a king because he'd broken his office. So he was like a tiger or a beast, a wild animal who could be dealt with in the appropriate way. And I think this was an act of incredible bravery. Very often the history books will tell you that this was predictable. Once Charles is put on trial, he's bound to be executed. But the only certainty was that Charles I was too arrogant to recognize that his life was in danger. And we know from research that the judges, the trial court, were making it up as they went along. It was contingent. They weren't sure what was happening. And if the king had pled, acknowledged the authority of the court, he might have got off. And as they said in the final judgment, we may not acquit the guilty. They literally cited from the Old Testament King Nebuchadnezzar, who was a bad tyrant, but he apologized. So Charles I refused to apologize, so had to die. But arguably, we didn't know he was going to die until the last 20 minutes or so. And even then, there might have been ways.
Hello there, Ron. Off with his head. Yes, off with his head. He got the execution there. We just heard that it was a swaft one blow to the head. So at least he died relatively quick. We haven't gotten to the details of the trial yet, but I just thought we could start with this video. But nice to see you there, Ron. And we'll continue letting him finish. But it's kind of weird. I haven't watched his video in full. But I was mentioning the fact of them believing that they were picked by God or a God themselves. And the idea that they could be killed is almost a little bit surprising, especially for the time period. And it was kind of funny that he basically went on to say pretty much the same thing I already said here. So I don't think it necessarily needs to be repeated, but I think it shows the significance of the group mentality can have on a government, especially during that time period. I don't know if you can necessarily say that mob rule or the consistency of a mass amount of people would work nowadays for government, especially in the United States, but it's an interesting concept to think about, really. If mob rule can ultimately lead to change, and probably not the execution necessarily, even if you don't like the people at the top of government, but ultimately the dismissal of them as the government officials and whatnot. But there's no way that in this example that the president now would be executed like they were in the 1600s. But it's an interesting concept to think about still.
Ways out, but he resolutely refused to acknowledge the power of the court. So this, it's about regime change in one sense, but this is a climacteric, very old-fashioned word, but a moment that really stunned the whole of Europe. And we know this because the Dutch, the French, the Spanish were reporting almost within hours of his execution. And if we think this world was a providential one, everything's in its order, a natural order. Every little stone is put there by God. Human beings, fathers ruling over mothers and daughters and sons, gentlemen ruling over servants, kings ruling over communities. Well, they've just chopped that off. So the whole state of nature is disrupted. So this would have, there are lots of reports of people falling down in faints, women aborting their children, all sorts of catastrophes, because the state of nature has been turned upside down. So it was almost incomprehensible, which is probably why most people in the UK today barely know it happened, because it was such a threat to the established order.
Whoa, that was very loud. But that was our first video there. We do have another video, but I think we're going to wait just a little bit before we get into our next YouTube video, which is a little bit longer. And I only watched a couple of minutes of it because I like to watch these things with fresh eyes and not necessarily have watched it before necessarily. But we're going to wait for this ad to come up here so we can get rid of it. We'll go start up. Come on, there you go. Alrighty, so we got this history article here. Let's see. Alrighty, let's see here. Okay. Let me jump to something we haven't done before, because we want to ultimately focus on the trial. I don't really see the trial in this article, so let's go to our next one. We want to focus on the trial. So this is by the UK Parliament.uk or Parliament.uk. However you want to say that. Excuse me. The trial of Charles I was one of the most monumentous events ever to have taken place in Westminster Hall. Kings have been deposed and murdered, but never had one been tried and commended to death while still king. Following the end of the Civil War, Charles I, actually we're going to full screen this, because it makes it a lot easier to read for everybody. There we go. Alrighty. We'll scroll this up. There we go. Alright, let's start again. Sound of trumpets. Following the end of the Civil War, Charles I was brought to trial in Westminster Hall on the 20th of January 1649. The sergeant at arms rode into the hall, carrying the mace and accompanied by 6 trumpets on a horseback. The king's trial was proclaimed to the sound of trumpets and drums at the south end of the hall. Bringing in the king through a large crowd at the north was too great of a risk. On the other hand, it was important that the trial be held in public. The court was divided from the public by a wood portion from wall to wall, backed by railings, and guards were stationed on the leads. The king appeared before his judges 4 times, charged with tyranny and treason. And exchanges always took a similar form, with the king challenging the court's authority and its right to try him. The nature of the trial. The nature of the trial reflects not simply the fact that the king was on trial, but that both the king and his judges took their stand on what are still crucial principles. The king on his right to trial by properly constituted court, acting on the basis of established law, and his accusers on the need to call it account a king they had described as tyrant who shed the blood of his people. The king's persistence disconcerted the judges. Did I say right? Yeah, disconcerted the judges. But there was a little doubt about the outcome, and the death sentence was proclaimed on the 27th of January. So like the first video mentioned, really, it didn't seem like the king ultimately thought his life was at stake or the potential to be jailed was at stake, because he was the king and he was handpicked by God or a god himself, hence the divine rule. So he did not think that a trial would have a stance over him because he's handpicked by God. That's pretty much the logic he had. So the idea that the trial can put him to death, the public can put him to death, the people can put him to death was a absurd concept and a kind of a crazy concept in his eyes, most likely. But the people were not so crazy in the perspective of wanting to trial the king and ultimately put the king to death because of the acts he did. Now, it would be interesting to find out some of the acts he did, because I haven't yet read anything about what King Charles I did on tyranny or treason, but I'm sure that we could find those here in a little bit. But let's read the rest of this article here. 11 years later, after the restoration of the monarchy under Charles II, many of the surviving were tried in Old Bailey Sessions House, and 10 were condemned and executed. The bodies of the key men who ordered the execution of Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, John Bradshaw, and Henry something, were exhumed and their heads stuck on poles on one of the hall's towers. Cromwell remained there for more than 20 years. So, because Cromwell was, as we heard in the video and first article, the main person behind Charles I. Let's see if we can't search Charles I treason acts. Let's see if we can't figure out some of the events that Charles did here, because that will be interesting. We know that he was tried, we know that he was found to death, and he was publicly executed. But let's see if we can't figure out some of the things he was tried for, what acts he did to ultimately receive the sentence of death. We're just going to go to Wikipedia here just to see if we can't get some general statements, because we need to figure out some basic things here. We can search up some more reliable articles if we want to, but let's just see if we can't get some basic concepts of what King Charles I did to deserve the penalty or execution of death. So let's see. Scrolling down here to see if we can't find what he did. We don't need the respiration necessarily. Let's try something. Let's try a different question. What did Charles I do Let's see. I don't know if we're going to get articles here. Let's just see if we can't find it on the BBC. See if we can't find some events, what he did. We1. Alright, here we go. We're going to start up top here, and then we'll scroll down and see if we can get some general information about Charles. Charles' reign began with an unpopular friendship with George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, who used his influence against the wishes of other nobility. Buckingham was assassinated in 1628. There was an ongoing tension with Parliament over money, made worse by the cost. There were ongoing tension with Parliament over money, made worse by the cost of war aboard. I think I just reread that, but it's okay. In addition, Charles favored a high Anglican form of worship, and his wife was Catholic. Both made many of the subjects suspicious, particularly the Puritans. Charles dissolved the Parliament 3 times between 1625 and 1629. In 1629, he dismantled the Parliament and resolved to rule alone. This forced him to raise revenue by non-parliamentary means, which made him increasingly unpopular. At the same time, there was a crackdown on Puritans and Catholics, and many immigrated to the American colonies. Unrest in Scotland because Charles attempted to force a new prayer book on the country and put an end to personal rule. He was forced to call a parliament to obtain funds to fight the Scots. In November 1641, tensions were raised even further with a disagreement over who should command an army to suppress an uprising in Ireland. Charles attempted to have 5 members of parliament arrested in August 1642. Raised the royal standard at Normanton, civil war began. The Royalists were defeated in 1645 to 1646 by a combination of Parliament's alliance with the Scots and the formation of the New Model Army In 1646, Charles surrendered to the Scots, who handed him over to the Parliament. He escaped to the Isle of Wight in 1647 and encouraged descended Scots to invade. The Second Civil War was over within a year with another royalist defeat by the parliamentarian general Oliver Cromwell. Convinced that there would never be peace while the king lived, a rump of radical MPs, including Cromwell, put him on trial for treason. He was found guilty and executed on the 30th of January 1649 outside the Bangerton House on Whitehill, London. So there we go. We get a little bit more history to why King Charles was sent to trial and ultimately sentenced to death. So we got a little bit of a backstory. I think our first article mentioned a civil war as being one of the reasons for his potential trial and therefore execution. But we get just a little bit more information about why King Charles was sent to execution. We already did this article, I believe. Yes, we did. That's what we started with. We'll get rid of that so I don't go back to it. And then this was just history. I don't think we're learning any information here. I'm just scanning through it here. Scanning through it, not scamming. Oh man, I've been watching too much scam baiting. Oop, probably shouldn't say that word. I'm gonna get the video taken down now. Nah. Alright, let's see. Yeah, I don't think that this gives us any more information. So I think we're going to go ahead and go to our next video. This is a YouTube video made by a channel I've watched a few videos from before. And usually their content is pretty good here. So I thought we could go ahead and give them a shot here again. And see what they have to say about King Charles and the trial that he ultimately implemented. I only watched the first couple of minutes of it, so we can watch most of this with fresh eyes, as all of you are watching with fresh eyes as well. But let me scroll and get this in view so that we can see everything, and then we can get started here. Alrighty, let's put these on here. Make sure the volume is good. Let's turn this up just a little bit and start.
On January 20th, 1649, Charles I, King of England, Scotland, and Ireland, appeared before the English High Court of Justice. Hours earlier, he had been officially charged with tyranny, treason, and murder. Oliver Cromwell watched from a window as the king approached the Palace of Westminster under armed guard.
We're gonna get an ad.
According to people in the room.
Let's let this video load up a little bit so that we get some general information here. We've already heard most of what has been said in this video so far, so I don't really have necessarily too much to offer, but we're just going to let the video load up just a little bit so that way we can watch it without too many interruptions, and hopefully our Wi-Fi will hold up, our internet connection, our power will hold up, because it has been raining very, very, very hard recently. It looks like most of the rain has stopped, so we should be good on that front. But I was a little bit worried about that not too long ago because of all of the craziness that we have in this house with rain, and it has basically rained for 2 weeks straight. So anybody that has farms, that's probably a very good thing, unless if your crops you planted don't like too much rain. I'm kind of going on a side tangent here, but we don't necessarily have any crops because the crops we did have, some fruit trees died in the ice apocalypse here in Texas. So I don't really have any reason to be happy about all of this rain. But anyway, let's think we've had enough time for the video to catch up, so we'll go ahead and let it play.
When Cromwell saw the king, he went white as a wall. He then went over to Lord President John Bradshaw, the guy who would be running the trial, and urgently whispered something in his ear. After a minute, Cromwell rose and addressed the larger group. "My masters, he has come, he has come. I desire you to let us resolve here what answer we shall give to the king when he comes before us. For the first question he will ask us will be, by what authority and commission do we try him?" Under what authority did they put the king on trial? The true answer was that it all came from the House of Commons, who had unilaterally and illegally declared its own supremacy. In other words, their legal authority was thin. Everybody knew this. For a time, the room was filled with an embarrassed silence. What on earth would they say to the king? One of the commissioners named Martin spoke up. "In the name of the Commons and Parliament assembled, and all the good people of England." It was a weak answer, but at least it was an answer. They'd go with that.
So, according to him, he doesn't necessarily think that they did ultimately have the authority to trial the king here, from my understanding so far. Could be wrong. I'm not necessarily a super good historian on this issue, and that is why we are learning about it before our show on Thursday with Anna Voltes. I'll go ahead and shout that out again. It'll be on his channel where we are talking about this trial and the event and the philosophy, history, and many other components to it. So it looks like they were wanting to put him to death, or at least put him to prison because of his civil war and not really necessarily liking the king, but they ultimately had to make themselves have a higher authority, or make themselves have enough of a stature to be able to have influence over the king and the procedures that were happening, which is a interesting concept, really. And we'll continue on with the video because we haven't read too much on the super detailed particulars of the trial. We are going to, after this video, read some pages from what Anna Voltes sent me from the trial itself, and that may get into a lot more details. But I just wanted to start more general before we went into the very specific of the trial and the events that happened directly from it. But we'll just go ahead and let this video play some more.
The full High Court of Justice entered Westminster Hall, where they awaited the king. Lord President Bradshaw took center stage. He feared assassination, and so he wore on his head a giant bulletproof hat. Even his allies thought he looked ridiculous. King Charles entered the hall and took his place before the tribunal. Before the trial began, a complete list of the members of the tribunal was entered onto the record. Several seats were empty. When Lord Fairfax's name was called, the commander-in-chief of the Parliamentarian Army, a voice rang out from the gallery. "He has more wit than to be here." It was the Lady Fairfax, his wife. Wild. This outburst was cause for concern within the tribunal, most of whom had served under Lord Fairfax during the Civil War. Was he trying to send them a message, or was the Lady Fairfax speaking for herself? Unclear. Either way, nobody dared to remove the commander-in-chief's wife. After an awkward silence, Lord President Bradshaw moved things along. He opened up proceedings with a long speech about how this court was acting on behalf of God, justice, the House of Commons, the people, blah blah blah. He then instructed the Solicitor General John Cook, the lead prosecutor, to begin reading the charges against the king. Charles had something else in mind. When John Cook began reading, the king lightly tapped him with his cane and indicated that he would like to speak. Cook ignored him and went back to reading the charges. The king was baffled by this and tapped him even harder, causing the silver hilt on his cane to fall off and hit the ground with a loud bang. This would have sounded like a musket shot, and it scared the living hell out of everybody. The entire room looked at the king as he bent down to retrieve his little ornament. The fact that nobody moved to help him was significant, not his last humiliation of the day. Solicitor General John Cook.
That's kind of funny. That is kind of funny. But ultimately, if you are the person prosecuting the king in this case, you kind of have to be a wild man. Even if it is for a great cause necessarily, you still have to be a little bit of a crazy man. And the idea that he did not let the king ultimately have his way is, I think, a power move in trying to prove his authority over the king, or at least equal authority over the king. And the king, once again, sees himself as the highest authority. So just even refusing to give in to general things like getting poked by a stick and letting him speak is still having significant importance to how the king views himself and to how he would see that move. Something as simple as that, the king is going to see as a lot more shocking than how the prosecution or how John or really anybody else of the commons or parliamentarians would see it.
Cook went back to reading the charges, which concluded by condemning the king as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and a public and implacable enemy of the Commonwealth of England. At this, Charles let out a quick burst of laughter. A traitor? A traitor against what? Himself? These charges made no sense. Lord President Bradshaw asked the king how he pled. Was he guilty, or did he maintain his innocence? The king responded, "There are many unlawful authorities in this world, thieves and robbers by the highway, but I would know by what lawful authority I was brought here." This is exactly what Cromwell had feared. It was a simple question, but it contained within it a sharp argument. First, and most importantly, before English law, a king could not be charged with a crime for any reason before any court. Everybody in the room knew this. The king wanted the tribunal to explain themselves. Second, even if a king could be charged with a crime, the legislation establishing the tribunal had been rejected by the House of Lords. So, under what authority was the king on trial today? It was a legitimate question. This got under Bradshaw's skin. His role as Lord President was not being shown the proper respect. He answered in a burst of anger. "In the name of the people of England, of which you were elected king." This was not the answer that they had all agreed to beforehand. Bradshaw had just made a massive blunder. It also gives us a hint as to how Bradshaw viewed the monarchy. Bradshaw had ties to radical Protestantism, and radical Protestants at the time used the word election to mean something that was random, arbitrary, and unearned. Bradshaw was a Republican, and that's how he secretly viewed the monarchy: random, arbitrary, and unearned. The king pounced at this slip of the tongue. He explained to the court that England had been a hereditary monarchy for 1,000 years, and that he, as the heir to that tradition, stood, quote, "more for the liberties of my people than any of my pretended judges. Therefore, show me by what authority I am seated here, and I will answer it." Charles could smell blood in the water. He knew that there was no precedent for what the High Court of Justice was doing here today. Clearly, they were just making it up as they went along. Bradshaw again asked the king to enter his plea. The king countered by asking on what legal authority he was brought here today.
It's kind of an interesting argument, really. I was reading Ron's comment there. I'll read it out loud here once we get this thing to load up, because reading on that screen is a lot trickier. Let me see here. So it is true. Elections are random and arbitrary. Yeah. Yeah, I think so. I think from the 1600s all the way to 2020, and all elections before and after are arbitrary and not important and don't lead to good results. Are the right result, whatever way you want to ultimately say. But honestly, that is a interesting defense to have for the king, because before this, as they mentioned, there's no precedent to have a king have been tried before, and I don't necessarily know if this is true or not, but even if a royal family member had ever been tried before, because if this is the first example of anybody in a royal family, let alone a king, has been put to trial, then there is no precedent at all. If there's a royal family member who has been on trial before, maybe the brother of a king, or the uncle, or something like that. Probably not uncle, because they would probably be a king somewhere else. But anyway, somebody who is an extension of the royal family been put to trial, then technically you could say there is precedent because they're within this royal family, but maybe not at the top of the royal family. So there is a very interesting legal argument. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the details here of how the judge or how the prosecution is going to argue it. But ultimately, we already know the verdict as to what happened, but getting from point A to B to C is going to be really the more interesting part here.
This went back and forth for quite a while, with Bradshaw becoming angrier and louder and more unhinged. Eventually, Charles said to Bradshaw, "You have shown no lawful authority to satisfy any reasonable man." Bradshaw shot back, "That is your apprehension. We are satisfied, who are your judges." Charles replied, "'Tis not my apprehension, nor yours either, that ought to decide it." Lord President Bradshaw was extremely frustrated. He adjourned proceedings for the day. They would try again tomorrow. As Charles was being escorted out of Westminster Hall, people began to chant, "God save the King!" The soldiers in the courtroom tried to drown this out by shouting over top of them, "Justice!" It was pandemonium. In her book, The English Civil War, A People's History, historian Diane Purkis provides a really good summary of the first day of the trial. She describes Charles's strategy as, quote, "both intelligent and stupid." He was displaying bright legal maneuvering, but his recalcitrance was also a tactically dim way of getting everybody's goat. She's right. Charles was running circles around Bradshaw, but he was needlessly antagonizing him in the process. So far, the whole thing was a mess.
We're going to get another lovely YouTube ad, but ultimately we do need to take some breaks and talk about it so we don't get copyright striked, even though it really would be interesting just to watch the video, but I guess that's not really the purpose here. Anyway, let me think here. So, the legal argument, and I don't necessarily want to repeat what we just heard, but the way the justice system worked, if I'm not mistaken there, was a vote on if they thought you if they thought you did the crime or you didn't do the crime. And if they thought you did the crime, then they could use any procedure, any point, any topic, anything to say that, yes, you were the one who did this crime. And it wasn't necessarily the way the justice system works in the United States, where you're innocent until proven guilty. It's not ultimately really what happened then. So if you're using any sort of reason to believe that you're the one can put this person in jail, or you're the one that can ultimately execute that person, then it's probably not a very good idea to make the person who is in charge of this procedure, or at least has a vote in your prison sentence or in your execution, to have the authority to do so. And that's kind of a interesting concept, and something that may have not have been so much considered. But I think that Charles was ultimately thinking that he was chosen by God, so the idea that he can be sentenced to jail, or let alone executed, was such a strange idea to him that he didn't even see a possibility of that ever happening. So he could use an argument like that, get them frustrated, and he would still have no legal stance ultimately to execute him. Because if they can't prove that they have jurisdiction, or if they can't prove that they have the authority to put you to jail, or the authority to execute you because you are the king, then ultimately a sentence can't be reached. And I think that's with the way Charles was viewing it, or he could have been frankly just trying to play with him because he never thought that he could go to jail or could be executed, because he has divine justice and the divine ability as the king of them. The idea that people can execute you when you're the one in charge of the people could have been the only stance that would make him just kind of play around a little bit and maybe not take it seriously. But if he is taking it seriously and trying to use it as a legal argument, they do have to prove that they have the power over you to do so. So that is interesting. And if they don't necessarily have a event that happened in the past to base it off of, they are the ones trying to build a mountain of evidence and trying to show claims, while the king is sitting at the top of the hill and saying that you don't have anything to build evidence on. So it is a interesting legal defense, and we'll continue the video to see kind of what happens from it.
On the second day of the trial, Lord President Bradshaw sought to take back the initiative and make sure that everybody recognized the High Court of Justice as a legitimate court of law. He began the day with another lengthy opening statement. He talked about the strong legal authority on display here today, and at the end, he asked Solicitor General John Cook to once more read the charges. When he was finished, Bradshaw again asked the king for his plea. The king calmly asked the High Court of Justice to show him upon what legal authority this trial was being held. Already they were back in this cul-de-sac. The king had clearly been working on his argument overnight, and he said to Bradshaw, "This is not my case alone. It is the freedom and liberty of the people of England, and do you pretend what you will, I stand more for their liberties. For if power without law may make laws, may alter the fundamental laws of the kingdom, I do not know what subject he is in England that can be sure of his life, or anything he calls his own." The king was trying to pull a switcheroo. The High Court of Justice had claimed to be acting on behalf of the people of England, but now Charles was trying to position himself as the true champion of liberty. He was arguing that if the aristocracy could ignore the rule of law and come after the king himself, nobody in England was safe. This must have been laughable to those who remembered being thrown in prison.
That's an interesting defense, and once again it goes back to the way that Charles I saw himself as the divine, as a god, or at least chosen by God. So therefore he has all authority over the people, and he probably saw the court's authority as something very little, maybe just a tiny little step above the average person, but he was so far up the staircase that he thought the court was just so insignificant. And I think we can kind of see that again here, and that's something that is an interesting concept. But Once again, I go back to the people who are in the court and are going to rule over King Charles, and if he's going to be executed, if he's going to prison, blah, 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 blah. They see their authority as being valid, and they ultimately have had authority over people, and maybe even authority over royal family members. I don't know that for sure, but I'm assuming that there has probably been something related to the royal family in the past, but maybe not ultimately the king or queen. But let's continue on.
For refusing to loan the king money, but here we are. Charles had skillfully maneuvered Bradshaw into a corner. Bradshaw interjected. "Sir, I must interrupt you. Sir, it seems you are entering on arguments and disputes about the authority of the court before which you are convented as prisoner. You may not do it." Bradshaw was trying to say that questioning the legitimacy of the court was against the rules. Kinda weak, if you ask me. The king continued to speak, something about law and reason. Bradshaw cut him off again. "You speak of laws and reason. It is fit. There should be law and reason, and those are both against you. The vote of the Commons of England in Parliament, that is the reason of the kingdom. It is the law of the kingdom." This last bit, about the Commons being the law of the kingdom, was incorrect. Under normal circumstances, the House of Lords and the monarch had to sign off on any new laws. The fact that the House of Commons had illegally declared its own supremacy was actually the central issue here, and reminding everybody of this actually kinda worked in the king's favor. It's puzzling why Bradshaw would go down this road. The king tried to interject, but Bradshaw cut him off again. "Sir, you are not to dispute our authority. You are told it again by the court." Again, the king tried to speak. "Sir, it will be taken notice of you that you stand in contempt of court." A contempt of court charge was a huge deal at this time. It meant that the trial could proceed without the defendant. The king replied to the Lord President, "I do not know how a king can be a delinquent." Continuing later, he said, "To demur against any proceedings is legal. I do demand that." The king was challenging the contempt charge on multiple fronts. He was saying, first, that a king cannot be held in contempt, and second, even if he could, simply asking, "Why am I here?" is perfectly legal. So far, they had not really answered that question. Let's pause here for a moment. The king was behaving as if refusing to enter a plea was some kind of immovable force. This wasn't exactly true. English law had a provision for situations like this. If a defendant refused to enter a plea, the law at the time empowered the court to take the defendant outside and torture them until they changed their mind. For real. King Charles was making a bet here. He was betting that the High Court of Justice wouldn't dare torture the King of England. He was right. They wouldn't dare. Bradshaw and company believed, rightly in my opinion, that any mistreatment of the king would cause public opinion to swing in his favor. It might even set off a royalist uprising. Way too risky. Bradshaw tried a new argument. He told the king that they had put one of his predecessors on trial before, and that had been entirely legitimate. Now, I have no idea what Bradshaw is talking about here. Plenty of kings had been imprisoned or forced to step down, but nothing like this, not a trial. Charles didn't know what he was talking about either. He interrupted Bradshaw. "I deny that! I deny it! Show me one precedent!" Bradshaw had made an assertion that he couldn't back up. His third major blunder. He responded, "Sir, you ought not to interrupt while the court is speaking to you. The point of precedent is not to be debated by you." Bradshaw was saying with a straight face that this court of law was not interested in hearing precedent? What? Bradshaw feebly asked again for the king to enter his plea, and again the king responded that he would be happy to do so once he knew under what authority this trial was being held. Bradshaw had had enough and called for the prisoner to be removed. But the king had more to say. He called yelled out, "Wait, I require some time to state my reasons." Bradshaw responded in anger, "Sir, it is not for prisoners to require." The king replied, "Sir, I am not an ordinary prisoner." Bradshaw started shouting again, but Charles talked over him and just started giving his speech anyway. He got to a part where he said that it was, quote, "for the liberty, freedom, and laws of my subjects that I ever took up." He stopped himself. Charles had just made a mistake. He was going to say, "took up arms," but this would have been an admission that he had started the Civil War. He corrected himself. "Defended myself with arms. I never took up arms against the people, but for the laws." That was a close one. At last, the king was taken away under guard. The calls of "God save the king" and "Justice" followed him out of the room. In the commotion, one of the members of the tribunal, a cobbler named John Hewson, pushed through the crowd and spat in the king's face. Charles calmly wiped his face clean, telling the cobbler, "Well, sir, God hath justice in store for you and me." Finally, day 2 of the trial was over. It was a disaster. You wouldn't have thought it possible, but Bradshaw had mucked things up, even worse than on day 1. King Charles was successfully positioning himself as a champion of the liberties of the people, and Bradshaw had failed to stop him. There was no excuse for the trial to be going this badly. That evening, Oliver Cromwell and some others met with Bradshaw and urged him to change tactics. This wasn't working. Bradshaw maybe didn't fully appreciate this, but people were terrified. Nobody knew if this new regime would survive. Members of the tribunal were actually being persuaded by the king's arguments. They now feared that the tribunal was not a legitimate court of law. Something had to change.
Another ad. Which is... I don't know if I ultimately have too much to add, really. I'm more just kind of observing the information in the video. But I mean, all of his arguments, I think, are kind of justified in a large part. And like the video basically says, the king is looking very likely to win the case by now with his argument, because they still have yet to present the reason for their authority over the king, because the king is, well, the king, and ultimately they have the most power, or by far the most power. So once again, it goes back to, if you can't prove authority, then how are you supposed to sentence him to jail or sentence him to execution that we know eventually happened? So it's going to be interesting to see how they're going to be able to reach those conclusions. But we're going to go ahead and see what they have to say about that.
Day 3 of the trial began in the old, familiar way. The king was hauled in, and Solicitor General John Cook read the charges. After yet another lengthy speech, Bradshaw asked the king for his plea. This time, Charles was silent. He appeared to be deep in thought. Finally, he spoke up. "When I was here yesterday, I did desire and begin to speak for the liberties of the people of England. I was interrupted. I desire to know yet whether I may speak freely or not." This was different. Bradshaw was caught off guard. He stumblingly told the king that he could not enter into a discourse at this time, and that first he must answer the charge laid before him. The king was well prepared. He raised his voice so everybody in the room could hear. "For the charge, I value it not a rush. It is the liberties of the people of England I stand for." He was playing to the crowd now. Bradshaw was instantly enraged. He rose to his feet and took a few steps towards the king, as if things were about to get physical. He shouted, "Truly, sir, men's intentions ought to be known by their actions. You have written your meaning in bloody characters throughout the whole kingdom." Bradshaw was speaking of the Civil War. How dare the king pretend to defend liberty when he had killed tens of thousands of his own people? The king tried to interject again, but Bradshaw turned and began speaking to the clerk. The king was to be held in contempt of court. He ended his instructions with the phrase, "Clerk, do your duty." At this, the king let out a snort and muttered something under his breath. Bradshaw turned to the king. "You are before a court of justice." The king looked to the row of soldiers behind him. "I see before me a power." With that, Lord President Bradshaw adjourned proceedings and ordered the prisoner removed. As promised, he had changed tactics. The king had been found in contempt of court. Under English law at the time, his presence at his own trial was no longer necessary. Bradshaw and the High Court of Justice would begin hearing evidence without him. The Solicitor General, John Cook, was distraught over...
That's interesting. A different turn. We haven't read that before. I wonder who would ultimately take the place of the king, because I'm assuming that, similar to how the United States works, that if someone is held in contempt of court, I believe that ultimately they could be silenced by a gag order, or potentially sent in their defense attorney, or an attorney would then represent them. So I'm assuming the king would have somebody similar to an attorney represent him in the case and be able to object, because the royal law at that time is similar to the way law works in America, but I'm not entirely sure if that is the case. But maybe they'll answer that question here in a little bit. But like they mentioned before, the idea of holding the king in contempt of court could spark a lot of movement. It could spark riots in the streets, because many people probably still saw the king as the head ruler of the country and the ruler of the country and the highest authority of the country. So the idea that you could put him to jail is a absurd concept and something that many people probably did not particularly like. So holding him in contempt of court was potentially very risky, but they still needed the trial to proceed, because they still ultimately really haven't answered the main question of the trial yet for the authority that they have over the king, because they mentioned law, and the law passage happens, they're like the first step of the law, they're like the Congress, but it still has to go to the Senate, and then it has to go to the king, or in the case of American politics, the Senate and president. The president ultimately signs. I think you get that perspective. So we're just going to let the video play, but that's very interesting and potentially risky.
How the trial...
It's risky, but they ultimately have to keep the procedures continuing, because they're only going in circles. So I think they saw that that is a risk, but it was a risk that needed to happen if they wanted the procedures to continue and ultimately lead to a verdict. But it could lead to many worse outcomes happening as well, I would think. But we'll continue.
Was going so far. He had always hoped and expected that the king would plead guilty. After this, he had assumed that the tribunal would be merciful and restore either him or his son to the throne. Instead, the king had just been found in contempt of court. It was finally dawning on Cook that this was not going to end well. As he walked home that evening, Cook's mind was full of dark thoughts. A former pupil spotted him across the street and ran over to pick his brain. "What's going to happen? What should we expect from the trial?" Cook answered, full of bitterness and regret. The king must die, and the monarchy must die with him.
Another ad. I'm gonna be getting I keep saying that I need to get ad blocker on this one too, but I guess I just haven't done it yet.
On the fourth day of the trial, the High Court of Justice met in the Painted Chamber, a much smaller adjoining room, to hear evidence. The Solicitor General, John Cook, had charged the king with being a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer. These would be tough charges to prove against the head of state, but fortunately the king would not be present to advocate in his own defense. Cook decided to really focus the testimony on whether or not Charles was a traitor, since it seemed obvious that the questions of tyranny and murder would follow naturally from that. At the time, the traditional definition of the word treason was when somebody took up arms against their king. But the House of Commons and the High Court of Justice had gone to great lengths to argue that the state's power emanated not from the king, but from the people. Think about this. If the king was the embodiment of the state, and the state's power came from the people, then attacking the people was kinda like attacking the king. This was a core tenet of popular sovereignty. Taking this to its logical conclusion, Solicitor General John Cook believed that all they had to do was prove that the king had taken up arms against his own people. Pretty simple. Cook began bringing forward a steady stream of witnesses to testify against the king. The next day, the High Court of Justice continued hearing from witnesses in the Painted Chamber. Again, the king was not present. In the end, 33 people provided testimony. Each told the tribunal that over the course of the Civil War, the king had personally ordered deadly attacks against the English people. That was it. In the end, the case was actually quite simple. Solicitor General John Cook believed that since the English people were sovereign, this was enough to prove treason and tyranny, and since these orders had resulted in tens of thousands of deaths, it was also enough to prove murder. The members of the High Court of Justice served as both judges and jury. Among themselves, here in the Painted Chamber, away from the public, they decided that the king was guilty. Oliver Cromwell pulled off with a small group of allies to write up a death sentence. But when Cromwell and friends presented the death sentence to the group, only 46 of the 135 members agreed to sign it. People were afraid. What if the king somehow returned to power? Anybody who signed this document would be guilty of treason and put to death. Cromwell and his allies stayed late into the evening, making threats, making promises, anything they could think of. In the end, they went from 46 names to 59 names. 59 was still far short of an absolute majority, but the legislation establishing the tribunal had been careful to say that they didn't actually need an absolute majority. Some have argued, and I'm inclined to believe this, that 59 was an important benchmark because it represented a majority of those who had actually shown up to the trial. This would be enough to satisfy the public. On the sixth day, the High Court of Justice met back in the original hall in Westminster. Today, the king was invited back to his own trial. When Charles entered the room, the soldiers met him with cries of "Justice" and "Execution." The day's proceedings began, as usual, with a long speech from Lord President Bradshaw. The king cut in and asked if he could speak. Bradshaw replied, "You may answer in your time. Hear the court first." The king pressed on. "It is only a word, a sudden judgment." Bradshaw cut the king off, telling him that he must hear the court first. Bradshaw continued to speak, saying, in part, that the king was charged with, quote, treason and other high crimes exhibited against him by the people of England. A woman's voice rang out from the gallery. "It is a lie, not a quarter of them." Another woman joined in. "Oliver Cromwell is a traitor." It was the Lady Fairfax again, but this time she had a friend with her. They were both wearing disguises. Orders were given, and soldiers pointed their muskets at the crowd. The room fell into chaos. The two women escaped in the confusion. Can I just say that wearing a disguise to a trial and then calling one of the judges a traitor is just so awesome? When order was restored, Bradshaw resumed his speech. He said that the tribunal had already agreed upon a sentence, which would be read momentarily. But if the king would like to make a speech in his own defense, now would be the time. Bradshaw was laying a clever trap. The phrase, "in his own defense," was key. If the king laid out a formal legal defense now, it would be an implicit acknowledgement of the legitimacy of the court. But Charles didn't fall into the trap. He said that he worried not for his own life, but rather for his conscience, for his honor, and for the peace of the kingdom. If you read between the lines, this was a threat. Charles continued. He had an offer, a compromise. He would agree, here and now, to a formal trial before Parliament. He had never recognized the legitimacy of the High Court of Justice, but they could all recognize the legitimacy of Parliament. There, the king would willingly subject himself to a fair public trial. The members of the tribunal had not anticipated this. The king was finally negotiating. Nobody wanted another civil war. The offer was tempting. But it was a trick. When the king said Parliament, he meant both houses of Parliament. The House of Commons remained sharply divided over the king's trial. The original vote to establish the tribunal had only been 26 to 20, quite narrow. On top of this, the House of Lords had always been against it. If there was a trial before the House of Commons and the House of Lords, the chances were pretty good that the king would be found innocent. This was a really clever gambit. It had the appearance of fairness, which was persuasive to those who were on the fence. One member of the tribunal, John Downes, spoke up. He had been one of the very last people to sign the king's death warrant, one of the people that Cromwell had threatened late last night. Now, he spoke in favor of the king's requests. "Have we hearts of stone? Are we men?" The people around him told him to be quiet, one whispering that he was putting his own life in danger. Downes raised his voice. "If I would die for it, I must do it." Cromwell was angry and rushed over to Downes' side, whispering loudly, "What do you mean to do? Cannot you be quiet?" Downes continued, growing even louder. "Sir, no, I cannot be quiet." Downes jumped to his feet and continued shouting. Cromwell gave Bradshaw a signal, and the Lord President adjourned the trial. Members of the tribunal retreated to an anteroom. A half hour later, the trial resumed. Downes' seat was empty. The king continued making his request for a trial before Parliament. When he was done, Bradshaw launched into yet another extremely long speech. He concluded by calling the king a tyrant, a traitor, and a murderer. The king realized that Bradshaw was just gonna ignore his request. He cut in. "I only desire a word before you give sentence." Bradshaw pressed on. "For all which crimes and treasons, this court doth adjudge that he, the said Charles Stuart, is a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body." Charles tried to speak once more, but he was pulled out of the room. The trial was over. The king had been sentenced to death. At the time of the trial of Charles I, there was a tradition in England that went back at least 100 years that went a little something like this. When the Crown and Parliament could not agree, the monarchy was tightly constrained by the law. But when the Crown and Parliament agreed, the English monarchy was among the most powerful institutions on earth. Part of this was propaganda, but it contained within it the seeds of popular sovereignty. Charles I had never agreed with this philosophy. He believed that relying on popular support diminished the powers of the crown. As a consequence, he had ruled as an authoritarian. But after 11 years under an authoritarian king, the people of England rose up and declared that sovereignty lay not with the crown, but with the people. Quite literally a revolutionary idea at the time. King Charles I was put to death on January 30th, 1649. At his execution, he spoke at length about the proper role of Parliament, telling the crowd that, quote, "a subject and a sovereign are clean different things." That had been true in the past, but now it was no longer the case. Popular sovereignty had come to England, which meant that it was now possible for monarchs to commit crimes against their own people.
So there was that video. That was actually a really good video. I'm glad we decided to watch all of that, because originally, like I said, I only watched the first about 5 minutes of it, but I have watched many other videos from this channel before, and usually they do a pretty good job with it. So I'm very happy that this video turned out pretty good as well, when it brought up many arguments for and against the way the trial procedures went throughout, telling just the facts of the trial. But ultimately, it makes you come away from the video thinking that the king was almost trialed in a wrong sort of perspective, and should have been slightly more fairer to the king, or at least allowed the king to have more arguments. It almost seemed a little bit sympathetic towards the king, necessarily. Maybe not, but that's just kind of the perspective I had coming out of the video, and something to add from it. But it told a lot of very good details in who ultimately was pro and who was ultimately con, and how the legal procedures went as far as the trial of the king, and a lot of the arguments that the king had. And it didn't really ultimately go into the arguments of the prosecution until it started to bring witnesses proving treason without the king being in court. But ultimately, we didn't really hear too much of the earlier charges or what was ultimately said there. So it will be interesting to hear some of those perspectives too, just to get kind of a full picture of the trial. But that ultimately seems to take that perspective away coming from it. But we're going to go over to our journal that Anna Volta sent us here, so that we can be on the same page. I'm not sure how much we're going to get into this. Probably just maybe 2-3 pages, maybe. Oops. Let me see. Is it one more page? Nope. Go down. There we go. We're going to get into this here next. Let me put this on full screen for us so we can see it a little bit better. We might have to adjust some things real quick, but it's a little bit easier to read when it's full screened. Nope, go down. There you go. So we're going to read probably maybe 2 pages of this, and then I'm going to have to get going for today. But this is from a book, I believe, on the perspective of the trial of Charles I and many other events around that same time period. Actually, we'll get this going. You can let me know if it's too loud, but just to have a little bit of some background noise going on, that doesn't help. So let's read here. The trial of Charles, the King of England, before the High Court of Justice for high treason. The following brief account of some procedures in the Parliament will serve as an introduction to the important trial. January 3rd, 1648, the Commons resolved that no further address be made to the King by themselves, nor by any other, without leave of both houses, and those that do not to conclude the penalty of high treason, and declare they will receive no more messages from him, and enjoin that no person whatsoever receive or bring any more messages from him to both or either houses or to any other person. January 15th, the Lords considered to those votes. August 17th, the Commons concur with the Lord that those votes for non-address to be revoked. November 20th. The army present their regiments to the parliament for bringing something to justice. November 24th, the treaty at the Isle of Wight voted to continue the 27th of November. This looks like a timeline, really. December 1st, Master Hollands presents an account of the treaty with the king, and the same day information was brought to them for the king being removed from Christbrook to the Hertz Castle. December 3rd, the king's answer to the prosecutions voted a ground of house procedure upon for settlement of the peace of the king. This looks like some headlines here, but maybe we'll read this just see if it's any more importance to it. In the original, all of the procedures in this case are stated to concur in 1648, arguably in the old computation of the commencement of the year from March 25th. But here the year is computed to begin on January the 1st, and the dates are alleged accordingly. Similar dates were made generally throughout the work. Upon this question, made his speech maintaining the sufficiency of his high majesty, answer as grounds and see blah 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 blah, to find that the most strenuous and the most powerful efforts in his favor upon the most critical occasion had been made by Prenudia, whom he had suffered his ministers in the Star Chamber to push to Barbosely in 1633 must have been a shock to the feelings of Charles, nearly as there is alternative given to the feelings of his son, James. The reply a further of Lord Russell. See notes from Lord Russell. Blah, 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 blah. We don't need to do that. We'll go back up to the top here. December 6th. Members were secured by colonial pride, I think. Or Colonial Pride, something. December 7th. The House of Commons appointed a day of humiliation, Peters, Carroll, and Magister to perform the duties. The several votes of the first for revoking the votes for non-address. That got very loud. Anyway, the several votes for revoking the votes for non-addresses to the king, for a treaty to be held with them, that its answers to the oppositions for a ground for peace, voted dishonorable and destructive. December 23rd. A committee was appointed to consider how to proceed in a way of justice against the king and other capital offenders. December 28th. An ordinance for trial for the king was read. January 1st, 1649, declared and adjured by the Commons that the fundamental laws it is reason in the King of England for the time being to levy war against the Parliament and the Kingdom. January 2nd, the Lords disgraced to the vote and cast it not, and the ordinance for trial for the King. January 3rd, the same vote was again to put to question the House of Commons and carried in the affirmative. January 4th, Master Garland presents a new ordinance for erecting in the High Court of Justice for the trial of the King, which was read for the first, second, and third time, ascended to, and passed the same day, and ordered no copy to be delivered. So this is a timeline of what happened here. This is also a little bit hard to read, I have to say. It looks like it was almost copied from the proceedings, but it isn't necessarily bad. It definitely gives a very good perspective on things. I'm just jumping ahead a little bit here. Let's see if we can't go down. This is all with Charles I. You know, I think what we're going to do, because I do have to get going here, I think I'm going to go ahead and end today for what we're talking about. And I think either tomorrow or it have to be tomorrow. I'll either have my podcast tomorrow or I'll do a second part on King Charles for preparation for Thursday on the stream I'm doing with Anna Voltis. So either way, I'm probably going to be doing some stream tomorrow, either my podcast or a part 2 series. And if I do a part 2 series on this, we will be reading more of this document and getting some readings from here, and maybe a little bit more of a analysis, educational stream instead of watching some videos here and there, but it's still good information, and that way we'll be on the same page when it actually comes time to the video on Thursday on Anna Volta's channel for getting the answers. But either way, I will be doing something tomorrow, either my podcast or part 2 episode, where we will be focusing on these documents if I choose to do that. But thank you so much for anybody that stopped by. Thank you, Ron Helton, for stopping by. Hopefully everything's going well with you and the chickens are happy and everything else, and hopefully your internet's gotten better for the last time we spoke. I highly appreciate you stopping by, and hopefully you'll catch me on the next one. See ya.